Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to FinStep Asia Token Bytes, one of our last ones for the year, but something special. I have with me someone I can call a friend, someone I can call a colleague, a partner, and somebody I look up to as well, especially in the media and thought leadership space, Mr. James DiBlasio. James, welcome to FinStep Asia Token Bytes.
Thank you, Musheer. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, it's the pleasure's all ours and an honor to have you here. Jim has recently, as he quoted about me 6 years ago, has stepped out on his own again with JDB Advisors. He is now the founder and managing partner. Jim, you want to tell us a little bit more about JDB before we delve into this world of fintech and tokenization and how your journey has been?
Okay, well, thanks. So I'm probably unlike most of the people on your program. I am a writer, journalist, and media entrepreneur. And so I'm a little bit of a misfit sometimes in the circles in which I travel, but you have to be in my line of work. And I have been since really the past almost 10 years, I have been focused on fintech and broadly defined. And prior to that, I was a traditional B2B business journalist. I set up a magazine a long time ago called Asia Investor, covering the asset management world and so on. So Digfin was my previous incarnation, which I co-founded and then led pretty much solo for a long time. I had the fortune to be able to sell that to someone and continue in a salary employee capacity to continue to run that. But that ended in the summer 2025. I did not know exactly what I was going to do, but I pretty much said, I'm never doing another media a business again because
famous last word.
Yes, I mean, there's hardly any money in media. And it's the whole framework of what is a media business has been so disintermediated by the free flow of information.
Sure.
But so the initial idea, why it's called JDB Advisors, was because I had served on the board of the FinTech Association. I'm trained for non-executive board type work, and I thought maybe I would want to do something in that vein. And I'm always open to if the right idea, the right people come up, so that's always a possibility. But the whole concept of it was I need to maintain my network and stay on top of things. And so almost subconsciously, I was like, well, I have to get back into writing stuff, using my own video channels. So within, I launched I registered the business in September?
Yeah.
And then after my non-compete was finished. And then by October, I'm writing stuff again.
Yeah.
And so I set up a new platform called jdbreport.com, which houses all the stuff, but you can also find it on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And so I'm back in the media game, sadly.
Look, it's I don't think it's sad. I think it's great for a lot of us. Your insights and thought leadership, I guess, is very valued in the circles here in Hong Kong because it's not just a regular news report. It comes with a very nuanced and deep understanding of both fintech and the TradFi, what if I'm going to use the term for asset management, etc., with the Asian investor work that we're doing. So then it's a mix of knowing those two. Plus, since you've been so actively involved and contributing to the ecosystem, we also know what's happening on the ground. Right? I think that's quite a very balanced mix that not too many journalists, not panning them. Some of them are just very content focused. Here's a news item. How do you respond to that? Let's write a news item, right?
Yeah.
And they never, because of also, it's partly the industry is responsible for that because I'm an admin on a bunch of industry groups, and it's like Chatham House rules only, no journalists, no regulators kind of conversation because people want to feel free to write. So then doesn't necessarily provide journalists the right access. In groups they learn a lot more. But you have that experience. Maybe going back a little bit and touching upon your journey, when did the bug of getting into media or journalism or writing come to, why to?
So I've
And
always
how did
been,
it come about? Yeah.
okay. I've always been a writer.
Okay.
Ever since I was a little kid, I liked writing stories, and I still do in my free time. I write fiction and things like that.
Yes. Yeah.
But when I went to university and then grad school, I needed to turn that into career.
Sure.
And I wasn't initially thinking journalism, but it seemed the best fit. The other alternative was something like corporate communications, which didn't really appeal to me as much. But I had also learned to take interest in. I didn't study journalism. I didn't think that was really a useful thing to do. I studied the things that interested me, so history, economics, politics, and then decided to apply journalism to things of interest. And I had already begun while in school role playing almost, you could say, business writing, and found it was actually quite interesting. It wasn't this dry arcane thing. It was actually alive and super interesting and vital. So I decided to move into financial journalism because it was something I thought I could do.
Yeah.
B, I thought it would be interesting, but I had a huge learning curve, far bigger than I think I even anticipated. And the early years were difficult because I really didn't know anything. But the more you learn, then of course you can accelerate that. So I sort of survived doing good enough by just being very proactive and sucking up as much as I could information and doing my best to get access to people. And I found moving from New York to Hong Kong really accelerated that because in New York, and I think in the UK and London, these are such large places. They're quite anonymous. If you're lucky enough to interview a banker, unless you're really if you're running deal book for the New York Times or you're a top reporter at the Wall Street Journal, of course you'll get access to all the real senior people. But I didn't have that. So when you do meet these people, it's very anonymous and you never see them again.
Yeah.
And so the culture is like, because there's no real bridge to begin with, you can burn whatever you come across.
Yeah.
And when I moved to Asia, it was a much smaller group. Back then, you didn't have a very strong corporate communications culture.
Yeah.
So very senior investment bankers, MD and above, were happy to speak with you as long as you respected their privacy and respected when a chat was just off the record.
Yeah.
And so you built up relationships that way, and you got a lot more insight into what was going on. And you do see these people. Hong Kong, not just because Hong Kong is geographically tight, dense, but at least in those days when I was traveling for these jobs, the same salespeople or people pitching clients would be in the same places.
Yeah.
So you could run into people in Singapore and Seoul and in China or Tokyo. You could just bump into them. So you wanted to have a sense of community, I think, while maintaining your independence and your credentials. So that was a new balance. You had to figure out how to walk that tightrope. But I found it was a more pleasant environment, but also I feel like I got a lot more access and therefore a much better understanding.
Yes, it's that I like that analogy of you could burn your bridges because you meet somebody once, they say what they say, and then you can go ahead and quote it, and being on the other side of not necessarily having code checks done. And that's fascinating that here in Asia, where people are typically more reserved, generally speaking, not necessarily as outgoing in the industry, it's building the relations that you spoke about. So burning bridges or building bridges, but with a lot of safeguards around it.
Yeah.
But what brought you to Hong Kong? And I hear the move from New York to Hong Kong, but what brought you here?
This is 1996.
Okay, just before the handover.
Yeah. And it was pretty straightforward. I had studied in Europe and was always keen to go back overseas because that was just a good thing.
Okay.
And I was working in New York for a group called Institutional Investor,
Okay.
which while I was employed by them, eventually got acquired by Money.
Yes.
And I guess it still sits within that. But at the time in New York City, Institutional Investor was the finance B2B. And I was just working really hard. It was one of the most stressful, but also one of the periods where you learn the most, like, a formative experience. And they had offices in London and in Hong Kong.
Okay.
And I put my hand up for Hong Kong because I thought I'd already, as a student, been in Europe. And I thought if I really wanted to have some understanding of the world, I should see a different part of the world.
Yeah.
And this was an opportunity. And so they liked my output.
Yeah.
And so they gave me that opportunity. So I showed up. It's hard to forget. It was January 1st when I flew out of New York, 1997.
Okay.
So I landed here on, I guess, the 2nd.
Sure.
And I had nothing but a duffel bag with clothes. And I had a job, but I had no place to live. I had no friends. I had no bank account. So it was a little precarious for a bit. But yeah, I showed up and started work the next day, basically, and just took from there.
There was also a great time to land in Hong Kong from
Great.
an economic perspective in the city.
Which I had no idea at the time, but it turned out to be an
That's
amazing
not right. I mean, in fact, that time in 1997, the concerns was on the opposite side. There's a hangover, so the system may collapse, and economically may not do well. While it turned out to be other way, and you're almost coming up to 20 years in a year's time.
No,
30 years, sorry.
yeah. So
Maths on that. And so now you've been here close to 30 years, as we've said, and you've seen various cycles that the economy's gone through. And I want to see this from a lens of knowing, one is anticipating maybe what's happening, because as a writer, as a journalist, you are looking to see what's the next story as well, like to a certain extent, I imagine. So you are future predicting to a certain extent or anticipating on one hand, while you're also surprised with a few things. I would love to hear if there are any stories or experiences that led to, this is also for people looking to maybe build a career in journalism, and we're talking about AI content everywhere, but I feel what you quite mentioned, which is very important, is AI can write based on what is available online and can do a damn good job.
Yes.
There's no pretending.
Or at least good enough.
Good enough, right? And depending on how well you build your prompts. But it still is that conversation like a private banker, right? It's access, right? Why nobody's been able to replace Bloomberg or Financial Times over the last 30 years, especially the news side, or Wall Street Journal for that matter, is because they have the access, they have people who will speak to them, which people aren't going to just speak to an AI per se. So I guess that's still a value in building that relation. So how did you go about, on one side, looking to anticipate what's going to happen next and trying to find the right people whom you can build relationships? And I would love to hear your approach. Was it just like, hey, these are the big names, I'm going to go for them? Or was it like, in a sense, building a relationship for the future as well?
So I think in terms of a media business, and this in general probably adheres to other businesses, but you need to create a chain of value. A media business in B2B is a commercial endeavor.
Sure.
I'm not there to hold powerful people to account to the general public, like
Sure.
say a general news report might be, but rather than shed light on what's going on, so that it provides some sort of value to people in that industry, and that can include pointing out if there's abuse or something like that. But I think it's often more prosaic. It's just helping people understand who's doing what's going on, which is not difficult because people are trying to hide it necessarily, but it's just confusing. And people themselves don't know how to explain what they do. And there is an element of finance, and we see this in crypto, that is deliberately obscuring just because it's not, they don't want They don't want people necessarily to know how the
Exactly.
yield is generated, right?
The gatekeeping of their idea or concept first.
Well, I mean, sometimes it's just down to I want to sell you an overpriced product, and so these don't work very closely at the TNC. So
Trust
the
me.
first, yeah. So the first experience I had in building a value chain was when I became the founding editor of Asian Investor, which was a magazine and a website which covered the institutional asset management industry in Asia Pacific. And the way to do that, I spent the first years pounding pavement trying to meet the asset owners, so pension funds, people who manage the money of insurance companies, the big government schemes. And I, after persistence, was able to begin to get on the record interviews with big sovereign wealth funds and the big Japanese and Korean pension funds and so on. So once you begin to get the apex of the industry where the money originates from, then the fund managers want to do business with you because they know that they're more likely to be made visible because they know that their clients might be reading it.
Yeah.
And then there's another layer of people that want to appeal to the fund managers, like custodian banks or other lawyers or other trustees or other service providers. So you end up creating, and then there's another offshoot which is more around the private wealth side. So you can create. So it was about making sure that you worked really hard to get the right people to show up, and then you can build a business around it. And I think that worked very well.
And I want to take a little deeper dive on that, right? You spoke about pension funds, etc., from East Asia, Korea, Japan, even here. Very well known to be reserved, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily comfortable in an English language medium, and even in local language, but in particular in English language medium. How did you build the trust with them that they're happy to speak to you or find somebody who is English itself is a big ask because these are the people who have all the money. They don't need anything from the market. It's not the sell side, it's the buy side, as we say, right? And so for what was that? How did you approach that? And would love to hear some cultural nuances on this. You had the Treasury Secretary Paul Chan last week speaking about how Hong Kong is looking to also attract more talent coming in from Europe and say North America, and this is going to be a cultural element that they need to be aware of. So I'd love to hear how you saw it at that time. It's more open now, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking a long time ago now, so I don't really remember the nitty gritty. But
Sure.
I think in general, first of all, I showed up. I traveled a lot. Spent a lot of time trying to be on the ground in places like Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, Beijing, and Southeast Asia. So with some mixed results. First, you have to get a few in. You get one or two lucky breaks, and then you can have something to show to other people. I had to have people. I guess some more experienced people would sometimes give me some pointers about how to, the language, the approach to use the people. You had to sort of learn to figure out the way to approach somebody.
Yeah.
And then the language issue was sometimes a problem. Particularly in Japan. I actually once or twice hired a translator to come with me on some meetings.
Sure.
But I found for most in these roles, these were people that were increasingly globalizing themselves. And so they needed to have somebody who could translate. I found often in Korea, the level of English was very low, but there was always somebody, usually a woman, who was in the office who would translate because she had gone to school in the US or had US work experience. So they might have in-house.
Yeah.
And then you are just very careful. You're courteous. You listen. I mean, the job is really mostly to listen. And it's okay if their English is broken. I mean, these weren't video things. These were all text at the time. So, it didn't have to be smooth. You just had to, do your best and let them say it the best they could in the way they wanted to. And once you get to be able to ask them relevant questions, they kind of figure that out. And because I'm a rarity, I mean, you really, back then, nobody was interviewing these people,
Yeah.
trying to. And then you've got, I mean, maybe a local press had some interest. And here's this, 33-year-old, foreign guy. So I was a little bit of exotic, I suppose. But once you show that you're serious and you can actually understand their business, you can understand the issues they face, they came to appreciate that because they realized that, all the fund managers that were out chasing them for business often had no clue. And so I could help them explain the realities of their situation, which was never simple. And then the fund managers, I was sort of amazed by this, but people began to in the industry began to see some value in working with me because they would never dare ask those questions. These were very simple questions, just about simple asset allocation or whatever, or just your views on something. And yet, I think they were so terrified of their own clients, or maybe terrified of their bosses if they annoyed the client, that they wouldn't even ask pretty straightforward questions of them. I mean, and we're talking about pretty senior salespeople. We're not talking about little seniors. So I found that there really was a need for a communication link that both sides found useful.
It's interesting how you put it, right? In the sense that quite often there's always this question of when you're selling something, you want access, you want something from people. What are you giving back?
Right.
That whole concept here, and it's like, okay, in this case, they need a message out, so you have to figure out what they may be needing, and it's not always as straightforward as down to conversations and approach. I want to just pivot a little bit in the similar theme. When I started my career, one of the things that happened was I was one of the early batches of electronic traders on CME trading futures for Eurodollar futures, interest rate futures. And probably was on CME was about 4 or 5 years old in terms of the big move having happened, and in London it's still very much pit based. And what we started seeing was a lot of the old pit traders had not managed to transition to electronic trading because the patterns, the way of operation was different, right?
Yes.
As a pit trader, you're looking at, the person in the room, what company they work for, what size, if it's a Goldman Sachs, is it a Salmon Brothers, is it a hedge fund, is it a small bank, whatever it is, who it is. And you can see their emotion when they're happy or they're sad. So you kind of can play. It's a bit like a poker game in almost in some senses. And you needed size to, be prominent. And it was in this cauldron of a room with 6,000 you're done. Whereas with electronic trading, you had no clue what was on the other side. You're now relying on patterns, models, etc., etc. And in a similar way, do you see that transition when you're doing print? It's a different medium in the sense people pick up a book and they read it, and it's a different aspect of how it is. And there's a limited number of magazines that somebody can have, if I may say so, right? Because once you go online, it's now you're competing with a very different world. You have potentially different elements. As some say, there's still people who like reading the physical copy of the Financial Times or the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong. But how did you see that? Didn't really change so much because it was the B2B world more so? Or did you see any changes in both, the reader behavior and the way you had to generate? Because online also demands a regular feed versus magazines were monthly or whatever, like weekly possibly. Right? So how do you see that transition?
Yeah, it was a big change. The whether it's good or bad, you can get a lot more data about who's reading it if it's online.
Yeah.
So you could begin to get a much clearer sense of that. You could also, if you can measure given stories, you can do A/B testing on which headline or whatever. I wasn't too interested in a lot of that stuff, but if somebody else wanted to do it, okay. And so the whole concept of SEO
Mhm.
was search engine optimization is brought in. And so the internet made it and has continued to do so with AI today, increasingly possible to access all kinds of information. You can get pretty much anything you want today, Um, and so we saw the role of very broadly speaking, of journalists. So that was also the rise of pundits and opinion. So it used to be opinion used to be just the op-ed, which was the back of the newspaper, one page. You had a couple of columnists, and that was it. Then that increasingly became what people were interested in. And then from there, it migrated into, whether it's an influencer on YouTube or TikTok, or it's, or today, I think the version of that is a Substack with individual newsletters and stuff that people follow the person rather than the institution.
Yeah.
So that's been one broad trend. So the disaggregation of media brands, except for the very few that have enough quality and resources. And the best ones survive because they also rely less on ads comparatively to subscriptions.
Sure.
And so you ended up with a much more subscription driven. So for the big players, subscriptions became maybe not the largest part of the revenue, but the bedrock around everything else goes. And yeah, so it's changed what people will pay for, where the revenue comes from. When I was an Asian investor, so this is the glory days in the 2000s and 2010s, people would pay a lot of money to be not just to advertise, but to like be on the back cover or the inside front cover. Or you could position these places very strategically. You would in advance set out, okay, so next in 3 months from now, we're going to do a big spread on Singapore or on whatever product or whatever. And then your salespeople would fan out, go sell that concept, and you would go create the content. Yeah. There might be versions of that online now, but I find it hard to imagine because it's sort of things move more quickly and more fluidly, and those sort of traditional advertising models, I don't think they would exist anymore.
And you were talking about that element of now your sales also changes in some sense. The sales cycles are no longer 3-6 months. Sometimes it's shorter sales cycle, but also more intense.
Yeah.
Right. And when you transition from Asian investor to Dutchman, right? What made you now say I'm more entered into my own entrepreneurship world?
Right.
Having worked and built a very well reputed, well-known brand, and it was a paying job, right? So
yes.
Going on to your own self, and having been there, I would love to hear where your story came from.
Okay, thank you. So after Asian Investor, while I was there, Asian Investor and its sister, the older sibling, Finance Asia, was acquired by a British publishing group called Haymarket.
Yes.
And so worked under Haymarket for a long time, and some good memories. And then for my sins, I was promoted to management and took over all of our finance titles.
Yeah.
And at which point I was also responsible for driving the first steps of the digital strategy.
Okay.
I wouldn't say I bathed myself in glory, but it was a good way to learn. And then for personal reasons, my wife got a secondment to Paris. Okay. And I'd been doing, at this point, the management thing for a couple of years. I begun losing touch with the marketplace. I felt like I had learned what I was going to learn from that. I wasn't learning anymore. And, I thought, okay, I've been with this group in total for probably about 16 years, different variations and guys and stuff. I thought, okay, I'll just cash my chips. So I quit and I followed my wife and had a wonderful time in Paris. And not working, just writing novels.
Good city to
It was fantastic. Doing my Hemingway thing.
Yeah.
And then we came back, and I did a little bit of freelancing, which, and then decided with a partner, a guy named Chris Ryan, who I know from Asian Investor Days. He had been He was CEO for MSCI in Asia.
Yeah.
And before that, he had also been CEO for the Asian Bank, CEO for firms like Fidelity and ING Investment Management. So, pretty, very senior connective person. So we decided to do DigFin because he had seen the rise of fintech.
Yeah.
And it had been stuff that I was really clueless about. But I could see these things were emerging. And so it was a good time to just try it. As it turned out, I ended up doing I created the product.
Yeah.
I did all the work and all the reporting. And we went our separate ways. It wasn't like this massive money spinner, start turning a money loser. We found some creative ways to blow cash. But I still thought there was something here as after a couple of years, when he wanted to exit, I had already built up a following, an audience, a brand, and my own knowledge. Like, it took a while because with DigFin, I wasn't just covering asset management, but payments,
Yes.
insurance, corporate banking, wealth, corporate banking, retail banking, capital markets, all these. So some of these areas I had some experience with, but some of them were completely new. Payments is what
You were the first co-chair of the Wealth Tech Committee of the FinTech Association.
Yeah, because that was a familiar that felt familiar to me. But I had to learn all this stuff. So I had built up this. It took me a while to be able to feel like I was fluent enough in all these different categories, and then understanding the role of data, AI, blockchain, cloud, etc. on all these things. The whole platform economy, e-commerce. So I wanted to. I didn't want to just say, well, I didn't want to just chuck it in. So I stuck with it, and then I got lucky with somebody who wanted to acquire the business, so I got to see my name.
But it's also something that people saw value in. Right?
Yeah, people saw began to see there was value.
You're still very well known in terms of this DigFin and the brand, and there are very few, as I said, people who understand the way you do in terms of you could not be a journalist and just be a pure strategist in a financial services firm driving digital very easily, in my view.
Right.
And then yes, you got acquired. You were there for a few years, and now you've again decided to go out on your own. Right?
Yeah.
And it feels like A1, you've got the experience of being acquired a couple of times. So maybe you have the knack of building the right businesses that end up attracting firms.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that was intentionally.
It's not the intention. I mean, if somebody wants to throw some money at me, okay. But no, that's not the idea. Is really
can be crypto as well, yeah, except in all forms.
Yeah. No, the idea was just I wanted to do something that I would enjoy doing, and where I felt like I could bring something to the table. And so it's more for myself in that sense.
It's for entrepreneurs, especially those of us who are with small teams or largely on our own.
Yes.
It can be a very lonely journey, right? It's as much as you'll have family, friends supporting you and all of that, but again, it's your business, you're growing, it's your heart that's driving it. As you said, sometimes it's conflicting with your commercial mind in terms of what to do. But how do you sustain yourself to say, okay, I want to drive this is my passion, but I also want this to be a successful business. So what is your, I wouldn't call it strategy, but how are you approaching the new James DiBlasio in terms of JDB Advisors? And as you said, you started initially thinking of it as more, let's get in as advising companies, start of some variety of different elements. And now it's back to a large extent also on thought leadership. And you continue your Substack is great. And we'll come to your writing very quickly soon. But I would love to hear how are you now approaching this next phase of James DiBlasio 3.0?
So the content by itself, I mean, maybe there'll be some advertising or sponsorship, great, fine. But that's not really going to move the needle.
Correct.
I think you have to be entrepreneurial. This is the thing I often will tell people who are interested in like a journalism career or something, is that whether you start in it or you want to stay in it, you now have to be much more entrepreneurial.
Sure.
And I think that's a good skill set for anybody to have. So you've got to find out ways to commercialize your own work. And the value is still being independent.
Yeah.
Kind of a voice of authority, not commanding, but just knowing how to help other people express their authority in the subject, bringing out the best in them for an audience. That audience might be your readership or somebody watching the video, but it could also be putting some people together in a room, or it could be helping people with their own event. They need people on stage who can make the content shine. And so for that, you need to be comfortable in your own skin. You need to be confident that you understand the subject very well. You may not have to be a subject matter expert, because that's what these people are.
Yeah.
But you need to know enough to ask them the right questions and keep them to help them express their knowledge in a way that everybody can get.
It's knowledge curation, if I can.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll steal that. So it's finding ways to use your independence, your authority, and a little bit, I guess, just having a vehicle to express this, to help other people achieve their own narrative storytelling goals. Everybody needs help. Everybody is on the one hand, it's super competitive in the sense that everybody makes content. Every bank, every fintech, every founder, they're out there, banging away on their own content. And I'm just one guy in a sea of this stuff. But the difference is that I'm independent, and I bring a certain credibility and certain quality and hopefully some professionalism. So that's what they don't have. So they either need a place for their content to go that's maybe different to like LinkedIn or X.
Yeah.
And they need someone to help them magnify their message. So there's still ways to serve the industry in a way that's not, you're emphasizing your independence. You're not compromising your independence. I think that's the difference. And that's what values.
I think also one point to make while we're speaking about, I was thinking about is a lot of what both of us do is more targeted towards business professionals or businesses, right? Which is not the same as something that want KOL on a TikTok or others, or more targeted towards a consumer or end user, right? The ones that we do scroll throughout the night on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. But long story short, I think that's also another message. Like, I think that audience doesn't have too many other avenues, and they have a few online venues, if I may call that, right, where they go for their information, their knowledge, and their keeping themselves updated. And I guess that's where it comes in. Still, yes, it's still website, I mean, to a certain extent, but also LinkedIn versus they're not going to be on TikTok looking for understanding of B2B necessarily. Say, okay, I need to get, and that's where I think curation of knowing the right people matters. Because when you talk about general stuff, so yes, credibility matters, those experience, etc. But then enough and more influencer will just generally talk about, oh, I did money this way, I that money. But you want to, from business's perspective of professionals, you really want a well-known personality, reputed business leader, company, or individual to be to hear from and learn from. Would that be an accurate?
Yeah. No, I mean it's correct. But that I think the main distinction is that you understand who your audience is, who their audience, whom they want to be their audience, and I think so. The principle, I think, is the same in B2C, but it's just a very different beast because of the wants, the nature of the place. But the principle is still, you need to find some way to enhance their message. If you're just a KOL, you might just be cashing a paycheck and without a whole lot of discrimination around how you present that information. Obviously, in a B2B world, you're expected to at least disclose the relationship before you dive into it. But I also act on the basis that my audience are smart people. They are, they know what's up. I mean, I can't tell them about things. They're in the industry. I'm on the fringes of the industry. I'm adjacent. So I'm not gonna, hoodwink anybody.
Fair. And it's also, I guess, not as dependent on the algo changing and when your life changes or somebody else.
I mean, those things do have an effect on B2B for sure. So you do have to always be on your toes.
Now, coming towards the end of this conversation, I do want to really touch upon another aspect of yours, which is not, I didn't know for many years till you invited us over for your book launch, which is your fiction writing.
Right.
And it's an interesting element of when, a lot of times when people are having a certain profession, what they do off work hours tends to be very different in some senses. But in your instance, it was, I guess it's your passion, but you've been writing for a long time. How did that come about? And is that your way of taking a break or, refreshing yourself away from the world of finance and others?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So I've always been a writer, and I get a real buzz out of writing fiction.
Okay.
And it's been a bumpy ride. I've come to really de-emphasize the commercial aspects of it. It's mostly just an exercise in futility.
Sure.
So I really write for the love of it, for the art of it. It's very different muscles than writing a nonfiction book.
Yeah.
I've written quite a few nonfiction books as well.
Yeah.
Some of them have been passion projects, but many of them I do with co-author partners.
Including the Arabian Crypto.
Arabian Crypto just came out this year with Charles Dawsey.
We'll put the link to the podcast, to the book on Amazon in the comment section below. So take a look.
So, and I was really pleased with the way Arabian Crypto came out. And, Charles has this, incredible network. We teamed up once before. He moved to Dubai. We thought we should do something about the digital asset space in UAE. And, it's just it's a rocket ship. So that was a fun project. And, I think, and for Charles, it's, and for other people who've worked with me to create books, it's an incredible door opener because, Charles was just as much part of the creation as I was.
Yeah.
It's a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Obviously we have our different strengths, but it's a collaborative effort. And so, you can use that to further enhance his profile and his network, which he's doing very successfully.
This has been a great conversation, and we should definitely do a few more in the future.
Sure.
Keep an eye out for collaborations between JDB Advisors and FinStep Asia.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
To your screens and your rooms very soon in terms of what we're going to be doing, especially in farm leadership and roundtables. Reach out if you're interested in having us curated for you. But before I end, right, I recently I've been engaging with a few young aspiring journalists, let's put it that way, right? And if you and any financial services and crypto in particular, if you had to give them 3 tips on how to build their career in this, what would be the 3 things they should?
So I already talked about entrepreneurialism.
Yeah.
You got to be fast on your feet, and you've got to be ready to figure out how you're going to, make something work, work for you, and be ready to make the jump when the time is right. Whether that's staying within journalism or using it as a springboard, something else.
Sure.
Second is domain expertise, domain knowledge and expertise. The only way to get ahead, at least in the B world, is you've got to know how to ask the right questions to the right people. You have to understand the industry you're in. It's a slow burn sometimes, but the best way to get out there is to talk to people and learn from the people who are doing it.
Correct.
And so there's no substitute, I don't think. And you can do your own supplemental reading around that, but I read a lot of books on finance and fintech and stuff, but it's talking to the experts and getting out there and developing that expertise so people know that you bring to them good questions and thoughtful things. They know, and then they'll want to know more about what to do. Third, so let's go back to the writing question.
Yeah.
This one's a bit of a minefield for journalists and writers because AI is amazing. So I think the way to approach this is when I'm doing creative writing, this is artistic expression, and I never use AI. And I doubt I ever will. And I, in fact, consider people who use AI to write, say, a novel, I consider it a fraud. But when it comes to doing a job, a commercial job that's not meant to be an artistic, not a purely creative enterprise, then it's a tool. And so I think that what the question is not AI or no AI. The question is, what is the value? And what are you going to get out of this yourself? So AI is great for many things. The more we use it, the more we find things that it's good for. But are you using it just to help you with your thinking, or are you using it as a substitute for thinking?
Yeah.
And if you're using it as a substitute for actually understanding what you're writing about, if you just try to plug in, your notes, which maybe you're just recorded anyway, and you plug it into something in terms of transcript, and in terms of story, you're not going to learn anything. You won't even know what's in your own story.
Correct.
So and then when you get to the entrepreneurial part where you've got to be in a room and moderate a session or talk to people or interview them, you're going to be an idiot.
You're going to get found out. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to be found out very fast, I think. So, so respect it as a tool, but most of all, remember that, if you are outsourcing the thinking process, then you're basically outsourcing the future.
And it won't take too much time before people figure that out. So,
I hope not.
James, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Musheer, I'm grateful again for the opportunity. And we've sort of downplayed it, but FinStep and JDB are going to be collaborating in 2026. We're looking for some cool projects with some great clients.
Yeah.
So we both have our own networks, our own intelligence, but two heads sometimes are better than one.
Collaboration, that's one of the key things to entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Thanks again. And ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for more of this in 2026 as we come towards the end of a very busy and eventful 2025 for digital assets and fintech. Stay tuned, like, follow, and subscribe to both FinStep Asia and JDB Advisors on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and our other platforms.